Distribution and Logistics webinar. I'm happy to introduce your presenter, Mark Hardison, CPIM Fellows, CSCP Fellows, CLTD Fellow. Mark?
Good day, everyone. Pleasure to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today regarding a subject that's near and dear to my heart. It's something I've been involved with off and on for my career of over 40 years, and I look forward to sharing some of the things that I've learned over that time, some of the things I've learned from APICS, and hopefully these will be applicable to you and your company as we go through this webinar today. What I'm truly hoping it will do is spark interest in you and your company to perhaps pursue more knowledge through APICS in this field. And that can be done through a couple of avenues that we'll talk about at the end of the webinar in more detail. So to give you a little bit of introduction to myself, I'm currently serving as the materials manager for Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals. We're a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical company based out of Hobart, New York. We both manufacture and distribute product from this particular facility. I've been involved in materials operations and supply chain management, which includes distribution logistics, for over 40 years. And then where I've truly had some real joy in the performance of my profession, I was asked to get involved with the Certified Supply Chain Professional Exam Committee. I was the founding chair of that committee back in 2006. Shortly after that time, I became the chair of the CPIM Basics of Supply Chain Management Exam Committee, which we now refer to as Part 1. And then more recently served as a founding member of the Certified Logistics Transportation Distribution Certification Exam Committee. And then when I'm not doing that, one of the things I've had the pleasure of doing, I was asked a couple years ago to serve as the instructor for the Principles of Distribution Logistics seminar, which has been taught to date almost 13 times across the United States. And I've been a member of APICS since 1978. And speaking personally, I can tell you that of all the things that have happened to me in my career, APICS has done more to transform my life and my career for the better ever since I got involved. And if you're not currently a member, I strongly encourage you to give it some consideration. With that in mind, what I'd like to share with you right now is I'd like to go into what we'll talk about during our time today. We're going to explore what are some of the challenges facing distribution and logistics today, not only in the United States, but around the world. We'll talk about what are the many functions performed by distribution and logistics. We'll also go into what's part of a distribution logistics strategy. Very, very important and foundational to anything that your company does in building out these disciplines. We'll also go into what's important to consider in the supply channel design as we look at product moving through the supply chain. We want to go into some of the elements that need to be considered as you design that. And then last but not least, we'll discuss how you can learn more about distribution and logistics through APICS and the Association for Supply Chain Management. So look forward to sharing those with you later. We'll close with opening up for several questions, and hopefully we'll have a beneficial hour together today. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and move forward. So what are some of the challenges facing distribution logistics today? It's becoming a ever-increasing topic in boardrooms all across the United States and around the globe for a variety of reasons, being driven very heavily by the very need to move product globally, and there's a degree of expertise that's lacking in many companies today. But just more recently, even in news articles that have come out within the last month and a half, starts to beg the question, are you and your team, are their skills, knowledge keeping pace with what is happening in today's market? So I just grabbed a couple of these headlines and clips from articles to share with you today just to try to illustrate my point. Wall Street Journal back on October 20th, one of their articles, warehouse hiring soars and growing rush for logistics workers. Job growth just in general in distribution centers pushing increases in distribution, transportation, logistics payrolls. And their estimate is that it's going to grow approximately 23,800 jobs here in the very near future, the largest expansion in a year. Business Insider Prime published an article, there's a shortage of truckers, and it's forcing the C-suite or your boardrooms to dramatically rethink how they transport their goods. Another article, Supply and Demand Chain Executive, talked about a fairly new topic for many of us. Some of us are still trying to understand what the technology means, but their article says that originally developed for Bitcoin, blockchain technology, which is the term that I'm referring to, blockchain technology has the potential to become the universal supply chain operating system. It operates like a distributed digital ledger where every entity involved in the supply chain has complete visibility at all times. Records held in blockchains are tamper-proof. Users can see everything but can't modify or delete information. Thus, there's an audit trail for every action. So you can just imagine when it comes to supply chain visibility, what blockchain might be able to do for organizations, all the way from perhaps clearing customs to increasing accounts payable flow when it's been confirmed that goods have been received. And then the last point, transport topics, electronics, supply chain dialogue here. Technology can help unlock capacity in the tight freight environment, experts say. So the question is, if there's already an existing problem with carrier capacity, what might technology do to be able to enable companies to make better use of their resources? So these are just some of the things that are pointing to our particular field and industry today. Another article found in Forbes back in April of this year, they published an article, 5 Reasons to Pursue a Career in Logistics. So whether you're in this field currently or you're considering getting involved in this field, maybe pursuing a career here, these were their comments. If you have the drive and determination to start at the bottom of the ladder and work your way up, then logistics could be for you. If your mind wasn't already made up, here are a few more reasons why logistics can provide security, stability, and opportunities going forward. Their first point was, you'll never be bored. There is so much diversification and so many different actions that take place every day, and the ever-changing times and even the regulations out there, you'll never lack for something new to do each day. Secondly, there's opportunities for career progression, even starting to see some C-level positions pop up in some companies for logistics and distribution. It's not location specific. With technology being an enabler now, you can work from just about anywhere to conduct transactions in business around the globe there. So it doesn't necessarily limit you if you choose that particular field or career. You might be able to live anywhere you want. Fourth, the ability to work with new technologies. I really see things like blockchain and improvements in terms of some of the communications technologies out there with cloud services that you're going to be able to do amazing things. We will be able to do amazing things in the future. And finally, it's extremely fulfilling work. I've done this now for a number of years, all the way from teaching it to actually traveling around the globe, working with foreign trade zones, a variety of different things. It is very, very gratifying when you can help a company, help your customers and your own company do things more efficiently and more productively. So a very, very exciting field, very exciting time to be talking about this particular topic, and I hope that what we go into over the next few minutes will spark your interest even more. So what are the many functions performed by distribution in logistics when we start talking about that? Let's try to establish a baseline at the beginning. So there's 2 definitions I'd like to focus in on. The first one being distribution. Distribution being the activities associated with movement of material, usually finished goods or service parts, but I will say that it doesn't necessarily have to be those items, from the manufacturer to the customer. These activities encompass the functions of transportation, warehousing, inventory control, material handling, order administration, site and location analysis, industrial packaging, data processing, and the communications network necessary for effective management. It includes all activities related to the physical distribution as well as the return of goods to the manufacturer. So a very lengthy, very large umbrella. You see a variety of things being talked about in there, but this particular field is of particular interest as you have companies like Amazon now beginning to not only distribute goods themselves, but now also getting into the logistics dimension as well. And it's becoming quite strategic where you have your distribution points and how fast you can serve your customer. It may make the determining factor, may be the determining factor in whether or not you're able to compete in the days ahead. The next definition I'd like to go through is logistics, and this often becomes confused with transportation distribution, so we'll try to clear this up. It's the larger umbrella talking about the art and science of obtaining, producing, and distributing material and product in the proper place and in proper quantities. So this is the much larger umbrella. Distribution falls under this, transportation falls under this. It's the field of logistics management that is creating value by optimizing logistics operations around the globe. Successful logistics programs are seeking to leverage the collaborative partnership of the various supply chain entities, and successful logistics also creates competitive advantage by flawlessly executing customer service objectives, conformance to quality standards, and increasing marketplace value. So when we get into distribution logistics, it's a rather vast field, as we just saw from the previous definitions. So I'd like to walk you through just some of the high points. I'm going to walk through each of these very quickly, but there is some element of each one of these potentially in a distribution and logistics channel of business. The first one being selling and promoting. Here, it's a matter of how do you get your goods to your customers, and it begins with a sale of the product itself. Now, there's two strategies that you possibly might undertake. You might have your own marketing direct sales team, or another strategy might be to have independent distributors work with you to sell and distribute your goods. There's no select way or set method for doing this. There's pros and cons with each. Probably comes down to what is your company's core competency. So that's a very significant part of how you distribute your product. Product assortment, when we think of going to the stores ourselves, but we go to a specialty store that only has one thing versus going to a store that has a wide variety of offerings. This is also a characteristic quite common for distributors. Usually customers prefer distributors that have a wide offering of products, so the greater the assortment, the more interest. For buyers, it means one-stop shopping for a multitude of items versus having to create a lot of different POs. Something I see quite a bit in my business, pharmaceuticals, where sometimes the quantities that are available to purchase, we wouldn't need a quantity that large, and we need it to be broken down. Thus, a term called bulk breaking, where distributors purchase large quantities themselves, or stock them in their inventories, and then they break them down into smaller desirable quantities that customers are willing to purchase, and they're able to command a premium for that, and that's how they make their money. Product postponement, another dimension of distribution, is delaying the transformation of product into the final form until the customer orders it. It may be putting on a little widget and adding some value there, or it might be just storing something like a nutritional product or a pharmaceutical product in its final container, but waiting to put a specific label on till they know the specific customer calls in. Examples of this would be like your drugstore brands of over-the-counter drugs, where you have the individual names of the drugstores placed on them. That's a great example of product postponement. Transportation is primarily focused on solving the problem of lost sales by positioning goods in the channel as quickly as possible, trying to get it from the point of origin to the point of consumption. We all understand that. In today's world, people want their products quickly. They don't want to wait a long time. And how you choose to transport your goods can make all the difference of winning in your particular marketplace. Warehousing ensures that the channel has sufficient inventory to meet the anticipated demand. Normally, warehouses are positioned as close to the customer as necessary to compete in a given market, and their primary job is so the customers don't have to wait, and that transportation time is the least distance possible between the distribution point and the consumer. Merchandising is specifically referring to the fact that many times goods shipped from a distribution center to the retailer still require some special configuration or retail display work done. And so oftentimes pallets of goods will come into a distribution center, be stored, and then special marketing materials will arrive, and a distribution center will configure those marketing materials either on top or potentially even begin to erect them before they go out to the retailers. So merchandising is a significant feature that can be offered by distribution. Sometimes it's as simple as transactions. One of the things that distribution centers often are able to do is reduce channel costs and facilitate financial settlements between partners. If this is a third-party logistics company, they might be serving as the intermediary between the actual supplier and the customer, and they can facilitate those transactions, helping hold down costs and manage financial settlement. And then the very last one, as you can imagine, you see a lot of transaction activity here performed by each one of these entities. There is a wealth, and I mean a wealth of information within the channel that, processed properly, can provide tremendous insights in describing what's currently going on in the supply chain and predicting what's going on in the future. We'll talk about this a little bit more in some slides coming up. So who is in the logistics distribution channel? Who are the players there? We look at this particular diagram, you see that product typically moves from left to right, as well as the invoicing. So as goods move down the supply chain toward the end customer, there's invoicing taking place typically between each of these entities for the sale of their goods. On the flip side, the demand, information, and payment flow is moving back up the supply chain from the customer to the entities above them. So let's go into each one of these entities, and they're probably self-descriptive, but let's just make sure we're clear on the different entities, types of entities we're talking about here. Begins with the materials supplier. These are traditionally either raw materials or components that are being provided, either being mined out of the earth or being produced in a factory and forwarded to an integrator or producer, who then is able to take and convert those into the finished goods that typically consumers are willing to accept, whether that be a piece of equipment, perhaps some chemical, or some other product that the consumer is willing to accept or wants to take possession of. Then we move into our next three entities here, the first being wholesaler and distributor. These next three are what we would refer to as intermediaries. Intermediaries basically fall into one of three categories. There's wholesalers and distributors. These take many, many forms. And in simplest form, these are middlemen between the manufacturer and the end customer. They can take many forms. We won't be able to develop all those today. The next category is a broker or a jobber. You see a lot of these in particular in international transactions where somebody wants to conduct business with somebody overseas. And what they really do is they facilitate transactions. They never take ownership of the goods, but they're able, because of either language or other capabilities, able to facilitate a sale that somebody else would otherwise not be able to make. So the goods never transfer into their ownership, but they facilitate the order, get the product shipped, and get it delivered to the customer. And then finally, the one that most of us are used to dealing with, the retail store, where we walk in and we're able to get our goods. But this form is changing also, and this is one of the reasons why I think this is becoming such a hot topic. We'll explore this a little more detail later. You have your traditional brick and mortar retailers like Walmart, but it's not limited just to them. You also have online retailers such as Amazon and others that you can go online, purchase your goods, and have this product arrive to your house, perhaps maybe even getting it faster rather than going into a retail store and not finding what you're looking for and having to have the retail store order it and have it shipped to you. You can do much of this from the convenience of your own home. And then obviously we understand the customer. They often determine, all of these members upstream, how many channel members are in between them, whether it's distribution points, sometimes even the production process is used, and they often have the ultimate say-so of what happens within the supply chain. So how do we begin to understand this? If you have all these different partners, a common term that's used is a channel design tree. And there's several different structures we're going to look at here to just kind of set the tone, but I'm one of those people personally that I need to see things graphically to begin to explain things, and a channel tree really helps me understand that, helps others understand that as we describe a supply chain. In this first example here, it's a very simple tree. You have a producer, and it goes directly from the producer to the customer. We would refer to this as a zero echelon distribution channel. There are no in-betweens, no intermediaries, and we'll use the term echelon going forward to describe these. There's nobody in between the producer and the customer. The second tree is an example of a single echelon. In this case, we have a single distribution center where the producer produces the goods, ships those to a central distribution point between themselves and the customer, and then on to the eventual customer from the distribution point. So a single echelon in this case being the distribution center in this tree. And then finally, a multi-echelon. This is one that's a little more convoluted, but you have a producer shipping to a distribution center, also moving goods through a jobber broker to an end customer. That distribution center ships to multiple regional warehouses. At least one of those regional warehouses ships to a retail store. And if you go to the very bottom, you see the customer might be able to get directly from the regional warehouse, the retail store, or through the jobber broker. So all of this is to essentially depict, and it's good to do this. I love 3M super sticky notes, not the regular Post-it notes, but they have a super sticky version. This is a great exercise to do in a conference room with others as you're trying to depict your supply chain, and you can go through and map these out very, very easily. Really are helpful in trying to help understand the supply chain. Conversely, we also need to talk about how goods go back up the supply chain nowadays, a term becoming more and more common, and that is reverse logistics. Here we're talking about the return of products and disposable waste back up the supply chain. It's become a very, very critical part of logistics management. This channel functions called reverse logistics because of the fact that that's exactly what it's doing. You're sending product back up the supply chain. It's really its own complete supply chain for moving products and materials back up the supply chain, for returning these goods, repairing them, remanufacturing, and or possibly recycling these goods. So conversely, where cash is normally flowing up the supply chain from the customer to all the way through to the material supplier, here it's just the opposite. The same is true of material flow. Material flow is going back up the supply chain instead of coming down it. Also, you see the various flows on the bottom: product, waste, components, even information flow. All these things are 100% the opposite direction that you saw in the original supply chain flow from the consumer or from the manufacturer to the consumer. So a very, very important point as we move forward. I think some of the things that I would stress to you about this, why this is so important, there's a very, very important aspect of trying to be conscious of the savings opportunities out there. A lot of electronics have precious metals within them that can be reclaimed and used again. You have the opportunity to repair and refurbish products and resell those goods. So that's just one of the savings, or several of the savings opportunities that are out there. Competitive edge. Green is getting increasing importance in the consumer buying decisions. So given one company that produces a good and they're very environmentally conscious versus someone who's recognized as not being sensitive to environmental factors, consumers will typically go with the, especially millennials, with those that are concerned with being green in today's market. There's also pressure because of those same things coming from consumers and shareholder groups to be wiser with what moves back up the supply chain and making sure that there's no waste ending up in a dump somewhere. There's also legislation coming to bear, and also foreign trade, a number of things that are pressuring companies to make sure that their reverse logistics channels are well defined and efficient. There's a growing market to recycle goods, that some companies are even marketing recyclable containers that companies can take back. And again, this is placing increased pressure for a supply chain that never existed before. How do you get these products back to their origin? And then finally, environmental awareness. Just, you've got to have a strategy in general. Between the global compact that the United Nations formed several years ago, to a variety of other initiatives, environmental awareness is just one of the most significant pressures that's driving the importance of reverse logistics going forward. So what's included in a distribution logistics strategy? A lot of these things sound somewhat strategic in nature. So what really is comprised in developing a strategy for your particular organization? There's really four cornerstones to a logistics strategy, and I guess you could say arguably there are three. At the center is customer service goals. Everything, and I want to emphasize everything with respect to logistics and distribution begins with how do you want to serve your customer? What are your requirements, both in terms of speed, in terms of quality, how the product moves to market? Once you know those, then that will help you define your other key points, beginning with inventory strategy. Here you're trying to determine what inventory levels are you going to carry? Am I going to postpone inventory? What product lines are going to be stored where? Even down to the demand management, whether a push and pull inventory deployment methodology is used, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Transportation. How do you get your goods to the market? There are a number of ramifications depending on where you position your distribution centers, and how much inventory will determine what type of transportation strategy you have to get to market. And then finally, the channel network strategy, where you're looking at decisions about where do I want to position these, how many distribution centers do I want, how large should they be. Here it's all about getting close to the customer. The closer you are, which is the primary reason for existing in a distribution environment in the first place, is making sure that you can service the market based on what the competitive needs are and what the market dictates. Now, all three of these strategies focused around customer service goals, in most companies, fly flat in the face of other competitive objectives. When we look at trying to reduce the amount of working capital tied up in businesses, we talk about adding more inventory. That's in direct conflict, because you're talking about when you add more inventory, you're increasing working capital. So that's one of the initial conflicts. If I have more distribution centers, and depending on the speed that I move to the market, that can fly in the face of trying to reduce costs. And all of those things, as you're trying to serve the customer better, more inventory, faster speeds, more distribution centers, those are all objectives, but those tend to fly in the face of some of the reduction efforts. So strategy is extremely important. It means getting to know your customers, getting to know the competitive market that you serve within. And once you have these, then you can begin to work outward from here and build your strategy out. So some of the challenges that also need to factor into your strategy as you think about how you would go to market. When we talk about multi-channel or omni-channel fulfillment, our market today is basically, I want to buy the product anywhere, just about through any method I want, and I want to be able to just ship it anywhere that I want. It requires flexible supply chains capable of responding to the customers through using multiple channels and delivery systems. And I remember a term many of you may not be familiar with yet. The term omni-channel really depicts all of these. It really means the consumer decides how he wants to order, where he wants to order, and where he wants to have the product shipped to him. He may want to pick it up in a store. He may want to have it delivered to a hotel room in Chicago, perhaps. So this is an increasing challenge. The traditional put it on a truck and ship it through a parcel service to the customer doesn't necessarily work anymore. So this is a key consideration. There's also the opportunity to leverage social media, where here we're talking about Facebook. You see a few ads on there. LinkedIn, other mobile apps enable you to view and purchase products and services and the convenience of your own phone. Recently, I had traveled to the APICS conference in Chicago, and I left an item at home. And I thought, well, I'm going to need that before the end of the week is, or before the end of the conference is done. And so I was able to place an order on my app on Friday evening, and it was delivered to the hotel, and I picked it up on Monday morning. Very, very convenient for me. Again, one of the many benefits, but you've got to have the methodology and your strategy to leverage this in your particular distribution channel. We talked about data earlier. I mentioned the benefit of channel information coming out. Just trying to even manage that wealth of information involves creating, enabling, and operating data storage, having large servers. How are you going to process that information, and how do you report out of it? to provide insight into the marketplace. So just being able to gather all that and absorb that and store that is one of the major challenges, but that doesn't end there. It doesn't become information until you can actually analyze it. So the big data gets converted into information through applying business analytics. Here you have both the opportunity to describe what's currently going on in the supply chain, but you may also, through the analytics and algorithms that are in some of these tools, be able to predict what is going to go on in the very near future, maybe giving you a competitive advantage to leapfrog your competition by responding to those predictions and positioning product in the market. That offers real value for supply chain decisions and opportunities to capitalize on the marketplace going forward. In addition, there's an increasing desire and need for companies to reach a high level of intimacy within their supply chain. So you have different companies, different enemies becoming intimate for the sake of conducting business and competing in their own market. Connectivity about what constitutes a successful customer buying experience is often determined by how well that information flows, how timely it is, and how much trust there is between trading partners. So when intimacy is established, you can respond as a team to challenges and opportunities when they arise. Leveraging channel partner strengths speaks to leveraging collaboration to increase profitability, reduce costs, build a common strategy, and converge technical and channel architectures that win customer business. Notice the word partner in there. If I were to circle a word, I would circle partner. This is where you have to build trust and relationships. It's back to that intimacy factor where you can begin to take actions and work together to figure out how you're going to respond to certain opportunities and challenges and eventually drive down costs for one another. Some of the work going on in our own organization right now is looking at how I can reduce the amount of packaging that I have coming in and perhaps maybe even have an opportunity to recycle these goods back up the supply chain to my suppliers. They're in here every week dropping off a load. They could easily take much of this product back. So a lot of opportunities to save money by working closely together. And then, as I mentioned earlier, some of the cloud and mobile technologies that are out there. There's a lot of integration of different information systems out there, and the ability to successfully do that allows you to become more agile and scale your resources to reduce risk, identify stronger network channel players, and increase supply chain demand sensing. So you can partner. You don't necessarily have to have people in on your own system, but together you can extract data out of the cloud to move data across the supply chain and work more closely together. All of these are challenges. Once you have your strategy, you have to figure out how you begin to deploy and respond, include these considerations in your strategy and tactical implementation. So as we're talking about designing now that we have a strategy, we can begin to think about what needs to go into a supply channel when we're designing it. One of the things that's there is essentially the aspect of the decisions that go forward. You need to conclude this. What kind of partners do I want to partner with? Do I want to go third-party logistics? Where do I want to position these particular facilities? What's the capacity need to be? Where are my production facilities? Where are the customers? And all of these things need to be factored in, including the information systems, to design our network. All of this is something that typically is not done over a day or perhaps even over a week. It's going to take a significant amount of work, getting your design trees out, starting to look at business partners and systems that complement the design that you're working on. A lot of work needs to be done in this particular area. So what is driving the need for this? Fundamentally, there's just functional performance. In the distribution logistics world, we refer to the utilities of time, place, and delivery. Depending on the efficiency of each one of these elements and each of the members determines how successful you're going to be in getting your product to the market reliably, on time, and at the least possible cost. So there's increasing pressure here for greater efficiency, and that's a key factor in the design. Reduce complexity. Where there's complexity, there's normally increased cost and increased opportunities for failure. So the more you can work with your partners to standardize some of the channel functions to help better facilitate transaction efficiencies in sorting products, quantities, and assortments are going to go out to in the marketplace, and the lot sizes, anything that you can do to reduce this will increase efficiencies and save cost and money all the way through the supply chain. And then the ability for specialization as channels become more complex. These decisions that are being made by various channel members may make it more warranted to create very specialized distribution centers, specialized transportation partners, and services. There's no set method, and going specialized distribution channel dependencies that we want to speak to here have to do primarily with inventory management. So we're talking about product flowing from the plant down through, let's example here, use the example of a central warehouse feeding a local warehouse before it goes to the customer. So we understand that outward flow from the plant to the consumer. And we talked earlier about the information flow back up the supply chain to the plant. So when we talk about these different entities and the dependencies, when it comes to distribution, we create these other points to decouple inventory movement, if you will, from the consumer or customer all the way back up the supply chain to the plant. It wouldn't be practical for someone who walked into a store and said, all right, I want to buy a riding lawnmower, and there's nothing at their local warehouse, and they have to order from a central warehouse who then has to order from the plant, and then they produce it. Most customers would never wait that long. So instead, because there's often differences in the flow of demand and the way that the plant needs to produce, we decouple inventory at these various points so that the customer is able to get the product when they want, but also the plant can continue to produce in an efficient manner and store the inventory where needed, so there's a consistent flow through the supply chain. So that's with respect to inventory, but also the information flow. We have replenishment points in between each of these entities as well. So when the consumer draws material from the next point up in the supply chain, that point just before them needs to be replenished, who then draws from the point beyond them and all the way back to the plant. So we decouple inventory, and yet we send replenishment signals based on these different entities. That's a key dependency as we set up our distribution network and plan for the demand and supply to meet the customer's demands. So the question then becomes, we're going to use two terms here. We're going to talk about either pushing demand and inventory out, or pushing inventory out into the supply chain, which we would do through an allocation method, or another term we'll use will be pull, where the consumer is really, as they trigger demand at the bottom of the supply chain, they pull product back through the supply chain to replenish it. And so the one is somewhat centralized in nature, where somebody is sitting in a central location with information. Forecasts are generated based on historical demand, and then decisions are made based on where they think the demand in the future will be based on what has happened historically. And that works extremely well if history repeats itself. However, in today's changing marketplace, there could be some real challenges with trying to anticipate demand and push it out there based on history. Conversely, pulling demand, trying to anticipate what's going on there, the advantage is the closer you are to the customer, the more specific the requirements are, but that also means trying to anticipate what that demand will be farther up the supply chain and being able to replenish quickly. So push and pull are the methodologies that essentially are available to us, and there are both technologies and methodologies to support each one of these in terms of supplying the supply chain. So when we look at these particular entities, very similar to what we saw at the top, moving from the right back, we'll go to the far left and come back to the middle. What typically works best is where the consumer or customer goes to their point of supply, one of the intermediaries we referred to earlier, and they draw the material out. So when they need something, they go and they essentially pull product from the supply chain. Going upstream, now, if that was a pharmaceutical ingredient in the market that I work in, I can't wait for somebody to produce it. It has to be in the drugstore when I go in to have that prescription filled. So often your manufacturers and raw materials upstream are having to push, we go to the far left, the process value chain has to push product into the supply chain in anticipation of somebody going to the pharmacy down the road and that supply needing to be replenished. And then in the middle, we have the delivery network, the value delivery network, where they're interacting with the push supply coming out of the front end of the supply chain to the consumer who's walking in and demanding product on the pull side. Basically, you have a balance of push and pull supplying the entire supply chain in a uniform fashion, in a fashion that meets a consistent market supply out there of products needed in the marketplace. So when we talk about push specifically, we're talking about someone creating a demand plan. They build or acquire inventory, and then those quantities of that inventory get pushed out in the supply channel using some form of algorithm. And if you have multiple sites and you were to tally up all those sites, that might represent 100% of the demand. Then each of those nodes in that distribution channel, one might have 20%, the other one might have 40%. If you work based on history, you would then push out 20% of what was produced to the one site that did 20%, 40% to the other, and so on and so forth. Now, this works really, really well for commodities, things like fashion apparel, foodstuffs, pharmaceuticals, perishables, a very, very common practice in those industries. Conversely, pull, you're talking about replenishment demand getting created at each supply channel node. So whether it's a regional warehouse supplying a local warehouse, going to a local retail store, as the supply begins to drop in each one of those locations, actions are taken to bring the inventory back up to a desired level. So it's originating at each node, and then resupply orders get kicked off, generated through the system, and then based on those orders, inventory is sent from upstream down to the satellite warehouses downstream. So that's pull. So we've talked a little bit about the high-level strategy. We've talked about designing channels. We've talked about getting product out there. And as you can imagine, it's very difficult to describe in an hour everything that takes place in this marketplace. So I want to encourage you, most of this content came out of a seminar written by a very good friend of many of ours at APICS, David Ross, who regrettably we lost over a year ago. David was a good friend and excellent mentor when it comes to knowledge within APICS. David wrote the Principles of Distribution Logistics seminar. And this is the seminar that I am teaching currently across the U.S. and one location, Canada, next year. And the essence of it is that distribution logistics professionals face critical challenges of running nimble, efficient processes in an era of unprecedented change. And the APICS Principles of Distribution Logistics seminar is designed to introduce operations management professionals to the field of distribution logistics management. It is appropriate for both beginning and experienced individuals. Even in preparing to teach this course, I learned a great deal in terms of thinking about strategy within our supply channel going forward. And so some of the things we've touched on today and what we'll cover in the class with the use of push and pull inventory replenishment in a multi-echelon environment. How do you integrate new technologies to help make your distribution channels more efficient and competitive? The fact that you need to be mindful of sustainability and green issues with what you do with your products and the waste coming from your supply chain. The ability to measure performance to ensure optimal efficiency and productivity. We even get into what are some of the appropriate measures to know how well you're performing within your organization. Obviously, it's all tied to customer services and the objectives that you have in supplying those markets and the warehousing and where you position those. You need to decide when you should be using the various types of transportation modes. We cover all of those at great length within the class. And then to set objectives for your warehouse design, automation, equipment, and layout. And that all takes place in the course of about an 8-hour class. It's a single day. And if you're interested in finding more about that, you can go to apics.org and look up the Principle of Distribution Logistics Seminar to learn how to register and where those locations are. And then the one that I would say is at the crown jewel, if you really want to dig into this and add to your arsenal as a supply chain professional, I would encourage you to pursue the Certified Logistics Transportation Distribution certification. This particular certification focuses on all the things that we talked about today in much more detail. And the thing that I'm most proud of here, it was created by APICS with a team of subject matter experts, including academics, consultants, and practitioners. It covers an extensive body of knowledge, and at the end, it's culminated with an examination to validate your knowledge in this area. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is turn this over to the audience and try to answer some questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mark. We do have time to address a few questions before we wrap up. So the first question I have for you is, why have distribution and logistics risen to the top of boardroom discussions in recent years?
It's a great question, Bob. This frequently gets discussed not only in the seminars that I participate in, but also within my own company. First of all, I would say the first and foremost reason is that we're in a global economy now. It's no longer moving within borders of countries. We're having to transit the entire globe to source raw materials, to provide goods to customers. The sheer methods that are involved, the regulations, it can't be done with traditional supply chain or operations management knowledge. I came out of the operations management field. I first entered into the supply chain practice within my company and moving goods around our globe. But then as I began to get deeper into that, I needed to know so much more about how do you move products, what are the regulations, what are the options for doing things. And I think in today's marketplace, you're going to see this become more and more of a topic. It's becoming very common to see within boardrooms. And I'm starting to even see a few C-level positions appointed to boards just to manage these specific areas. So great question.
Yeah, no, thank you for answering it. You mentioned reports of truck driver shortages and that companies are experiencing difficulties in booking carriers to move freight. How does APICS training help solve these problems?
Another great question, one I wish I didn't have to answer. I happen to work within the Catskills of New York, and there's not a lot of other businesses around here, so we frequently encounter problems getting carriers to deliver our freight and also to haul our goods to market. I thought it was limited to just me and the Catskills until recently at the APICS conference in Chicago. I was talking with a fellow colleague, and he's right in the middle of Phoenix, and he said he's having problems getting carriers. And I think there's a number of things driving this. One, you've got a number of older baby boomers that have been performing truck driving duties, so drivers are starting to retire. And frankly, it's just not a very sexy job to be out there driving a truck, or at least that's the perception of a lot of the younger generation that is coming up out of high school. So there are a lot of things that are starting to happen within the businesses that provide freight solutions, but it can't end just with them. I think we can't afford to wait in our businesses. And so it becomes a matter of strategy and tactics to develop alternative methods, to find solutions, to partner with other people, whether that's partnering and perhaps signing a contract with a carrier to guarantee services, or maybe partnering with other industry partners to move goods around the supply chain. So I think it's going to be on the increase. I've seen remarks about driverless trucks and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, it's going to take intelligence, and that's not going to come from a computer to make many of these decisions. And so I really believe that the profession that we're talking about here today is going to be the key to unlocking some of these solutions and solving problems going forward. I believe they will be solved, but it's not going to be using the old traditional methodology and thinking.
Very good. So the last question we've got before we wrap up is, what is the difference between the Principles of Distribution and Logistics seminar and the CLTD certification?
Okay, thanks, Bob. It's another great question. I frequently get asked that because I've actually had a few people show up in my seminars thinking that it was a preparation class for the CLTD exam. I'm actually obligated to not teach logistics, transportation, distribution content, exam content in my class, but clearly there is some overlap that you will learn in the seminar. The seminar is a one-day event targeted toward people that aren't necessarily in logistics, transportation, supply chain management today, but want to learn more. I've had operations managers come in. I've had marketing and sales team come in. I've even had 2 or 3 individuals that have just become part of a new organization. They're getting ready to set up their supply chain and distribution channels, and they want to come in and learn how to do that. It's a quick one-day primer over many of these points. It begins with the strategy dialogues that we were having earlier, goes in much deeper detail, and then starts to get into some of the options and considerations that someone can go back and maybe begin to interact more intelligently with their organization, more equipped to understand some of the terminology and provide some options. CLTD is, I said, really the crown jewel. It is developed by certification professionals that have worked with other exams. It's also brought over much of the experience of our friends in the American Society of Transportation Logistics. Many of the academics and professionals, consultants from that group came over and helped develop this. They brought their expertise, and it's an extensive course built on multiple references, validated by a testing service with a psychometrician to make sure we're capturing the content that is really going on in the marketplace out there. We do a job task analysis, try to understand what professionals in this field are doing on a day-to-day basis, and then making sure there is content in the exam that is that's going to equip those individuals once they're certified to go back in their marketplace and be prepared to discuss those items. It's a much more extensive class. It involves some self-study. There's also review courses available that you can take either as part of a local group, or you can sign online. There are some options. You go to the APICS website to work through local colleges that have video online classes that you can participate in as well. I highly recommend it. I think it complements the CSCP, Certified Supply Chain Professional, very, very well. And for us old operations management guys who didn't understand this stuff, both are very, very appropriate to help us expand our knowledge, our body of knowledge to compete in the marketplace going forward.
That's great, Mark. I appreciate your making that distinguish between the two programs, and I know that'll be helpful for a lot of us. Well, thank you again, Mark, for sharing your experiences in this presentation, and thank you to our viewers. All content and materials included in this APICS webinar are the property of APICS and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved.